Listen. Okay.
We good?
Yes.
And everyone can see this? Everyone can see my mouse?
Yes.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to my provisional year review, and thanks for coming along into this online format. I hope everyone's doing well. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about what I've been looking at so far during my PhD. So we've been looking at affective processes around mathematics assessments. Specifically, I've been interested in how students' beliefs and emotions around assessment taking change over time and their relationship with academic performance. So I'm going to start by talking about what affect is. When I say affective processes, what am I talking about? So affect includes our beliefs, our attitudes, and our emotions. When we discuss affect, we have this idea of global affect and local affect. I realize most of you probably can't see me gesturing now. So global affect has to do more with our stable or more fixed beliefs or emotions around certain things. And local affect has to do more with things that are happening in the moment, the processes that are happening while we're taking a test or while we're solving a problem. And so why is this important in the context of education? Well, affect is very closely related to cognition. And since I am specifically interested in assessment, it's related to performance. So I'll give you a little example of how this might work in the context of anxiety around test taking. So if someone performs poorly in a test, this may then increase their trait anxiety, their general anxiety around test taking. Having high trait anxiety may then influence how anxious you feel in the moment of taking a test. And studies have shown that anxiety can impact your attention, which in turn will lead to poor performance. In the other direction, high trait anxiety has been shown to negatively impact performance, and performing poorly can increase how anxious we are in the moment. If you're taking a test and you're struggling, that can increase how anxious you feel at the time, and repeated experiences of anxiety can then enforce it and become more of a stable emotional reaction to test taking. So due to this interaction with cognition and performance, understanding tertiary student assessment-related affect is critical to designing pedagogy and assessment structures, which are conducive not only to their achievement, but whether they pursue the subject at all. So I'll give you a little context on where I'm doing this research and why. Maths 208 in 2016 was redesigned to include these frequent online quizzes. I know some of you have been involved in these courses. So they're just multiple choice, 3 times a week, just a couple of questions that take place online. And so it's hypothesized based on prior research and existing theory that the use of these quizzes might increase students' beliefs about their ability to succeed, decrease negative emotions, and increase positive emotions associated with mathematics assessments. So now I'm going to provide you some background on the 3 affective constructs that I'm investigating in my research. The first is achievement emotions. Achievement emotions are essentially emotions that have to do with achievement. So emotions experienced by learners that relate to achievement activities or achievement outcomes. And it's generally been shown that positive emotions correlate positively with lots of good things like engagement and attention, motivation, and academic performance, whereas negative emotions have been shown generally to correlate negatively with these things. I'll just mention, though, that more complicated emotions, such as anxiety, have been shown to have variable effects, and there's evidence that it may be student dependent. So I will elaborate later on how we're addressing some of these more nuanced emotions and how different groups of students may be affected differently. We're understanding achievement emotions through the lens of the control value theory. So this basically says that emotions are a product of our subjective control and our subjective value of an achievement activity or outcome. So in the case of an assessment, if we perceive obtaining success as important, but we're not really sure how much control we have over the outcome, we might experience hope. But if we are focused on avoiding failure and we're not really sure how much control we have over the outcome, we might experience anxiety. And this suggests again that these things emotions aren't mutually exclusive. Okay, so what does research tell us about emotions during assessment in particular? Well, studies have demonstrated a negative correlation between test anxiety and achievement. Most research, the largest body of research, is focusing on test anxiety, but the few other studies that have been conducted with other emotions around test taking tend to show that positive emotions correlate positively with performance and negative emotions correlate negatively. And I'll just give you a little background on online assessment emotions, because we're talking about these online quizzes as well. Studies have indicated that students experience less stress and less anxiety in summative assessment that takes place online. And in particular, in my honors research with Dr. Evans, we found that students reported significantly more positive emotions and significantly fewer negative emotions around taking online quizzes than compared to a traditional classroom test. So experiencing more positive things was something that we were quite interested in. A limitation of this study, though, was when we conducted the research, we weren't sure at that point, because we didn't have a control group, whether these quizzes actually impacted how students felt about the test, whether having these frequent positive experiences in some form of summative assessment impacted how they felt positively about taking the mid-semester test. So this brings me to this idea of habitualizing achievement emotions. So repetitions of emotions can cause these cognitive appraisals, like our control, how much control do I have, how much value do I have of this activity? It can cause it to be bypassed, leading the emotions to become habitualized in recurring scenarios. And this has been specifically looked at in the case of anxiety. But also there have been shown to be reciprocal effects between achievement and emotions. So experience with success promote positive emotions, and experiences with failure promote negative emotions, and vice versa. So more research is needed to understand how assessment-related emotions can change across time. And in particular, there is no research on whether recurring positive emotions in one form of assessment influence the trait emotions in relation to another form of assessment. Secondly, the second construct that I'm looking at is self-efficacy, which is essentially the beliefs in our own abilities. It's important in education because it's a well-known predictor of academic achievement. And in these contexts, experiences similar to what I was just saying about emotions, experiences of success positively influence the development of self-efficacy, while failure impairs it. And in existing research on these online quizzes in 208, the studies have claimed that online quizzes allow for enhancing opportunities to enhance self-efficacy in students. So we set out to validate this claim as well around assessment self-efficacy in both the quiz and the final exam. But in order to investigate this, we first needed to be able to interpret student assessment related self-efficacy. So how should we measure self-efficacy? Bandera proposes that self-efficacy measures should be both content and context specific. And studies have supported this claim that generalized mathematics self-efficacy is distinct from test-related self-efficacy. So to provide an example, a student can feel that they're able to calculate a derivative, but not necessarily feel like they're able to stay calm during an exam. Despite this, many studies actually only look at general academic self-efficacy without taking into account assessment-related self-efficacy. So the point that I'm trying to drive home here is that the components of taking an assessment aren't limited to the content that's on the assessment. There are other things that students may or may not be efficacious about, such as their ability to emotionally regulate or their ability to manage their time. And there is currently no instrument existing to measure this. Our final construct that we're looking at is stress mindset, which is a relatively new idea. And it essentially challenges the view that stress is inherently negative. Stress mindset has to do with the extent of your beliefs that stress has enhancing or debilitating consequences. So for example, some people might find the right amount of stress to be motivating. And also it's been shown to affect the amount of stress or the amount of stress experienced psychologically. And so this is one of the ways that we're trying to account for differences in students. Unlike existing research, we've included this as a moderator to understand how different groups of students may experience the influence of self-efficacy or the influence of achievement emotions differently, particularly pertaining to their performance. So now moving on to our aims for the research. As most tertiary institutions measure student progress through summative assessment, it's critical that we address the affective components in order for these assessments to be useful to measure their progress. The students in Maths 208 in particular can spend over 15 hours on these quizzes. So it's important to evaluate the impact these quizzes have on student assessment-related self-efficacy beliefs and their emotions. So to do this, we first needed to develop and validate the measure for assessment self-efficacy, which we're calling the MACE. Secondly, no longitudinal studies have been conducted as to how exam-related trait emotions and self-efficacy change over the course of semester. So this is something that we wanted to address. To be explicit, the students in Maths 208, while we're running the study, aren't taking another exam between the first week and the last week of semester. So does their exam-related affect change, and why would this be the case? Finally, we're aiming to investigate the relationship between assessment-related affect and academic achievement. The study is looking to identify factors that play a role in changing global affect in order to identify suitable interventions that may be a positive influence on affect and performance, such as using these frequent online quizzes. Disentangling these relationships is going to have practical implications to course design and assessment structure. So where did we conduct the studies? We've conducted 2 studies. We ran a pilot study earlier in the year, which was a sample of university students that we sourced through Prolific, and they completed an anonymous survey online. Our main study was a quasi-experimental study. We didn't have a control group that had repeated measures throughout the semester. This took place in Maths 208. And Maths 208 is a service mathematics course, so it's not specifically for math majors. It's designed to support other majors. And the course, like I've mentioned before, includes this frequent online assessment, as well as a traditional 50% 2-hour invigilated exam. And we conducted this study through administering 3 10-minute online questionnaires at 3 time points in the semester in weeks 1, weeks 5, and week 11. Our primary data source was a survey instrument, which included our newly developed MACE, which I will talk to you about shortly, an adapted version of the Achievement Emotions Questionnaire, and I'm not going to get into how we adapted it for time, and the Stress Mindset Measure. We also included several demographic questions like gender. And in the main study, we're also collecting student performance measurements, including their final exam grade. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we've done so far. We needed to develop the measure of assessment self-efficacy so that we could track students changing self-efficacy over the course of semester. So this is a scale. A scale is a collection of statements or items that participants respond to in order for us to measure some sort of underlying construct. So you might have had an experience with a scale before. If you've completed a survey and you have to respond from strongly agree to strongly disagree. And the underlying construct that we're trying to measure here is assessment-related self-efficacy. So how did we design the scale? Well, we started by following Bandura's guidelines for developing self-efficacy scales, which was a pretty handy place to start. And the statements were written to assess participants' beliefs and their ability to understand, to perform, and to emotionally regulate while studying and during an assessment. Responses were measured on a slider scale from 1 to 100. So for example, we would have a statement like, even when I struggle during the assessment, I'm able to stay positive about my ability to succeed. And students would respond from 1 to 100 with how much they agreed with this. And students responded to this under 2 different assessment conditions. One was a quiz scenario, which is just like we've been discussing, a low stakes, low percentage online multiple choice quiz. And another was an exam scenario, which is, 50% invigilated traditional mathematics exam. So these scenarios were randomly presented and they responded to the scale to both of them. So what were our findings? I'm not going to get into the whole breakdown of pilot testing, but we found that we had excellent internal consistency, and pilot testing suggested that we had a 2-factor model. So what this means is that, I'll just break this down quickly. On the left of your screen is the exam scale, and on the right of the screen is your quiz scale. And our rectangles are our observed variables. They're the statements that students responded to. And the big ovals, the one that says abilities and the one that says emotional regulation, are our latent factors. So one I've chosen to call performance and comprehension abilities, and the other one I've chosen to call emotional regulation. So the latent factors are explaining the shared variance in our observed variables. And overall, these models represent assessment-related self-efficacy. So when we ran this at time point 1, we found that the 2-factor model offered an acceptable fit for both types of assessment. So I've shown you statistically that we've measured something. There's some underlying constructs there. There's shared variance that's determining we have latent factors there. But how do we know that what we're actually measuring is self-efficacy, besides the fact that I situated it in the theory? Well, research demonstrates that self-efficacy associates positively with positive emotions and negatively with negative emotions. So we looked for evidence of convergent and divergent validity of the MACE through looking at student emotions. And this is our resulting correlation matrix from the time point 1. Our latent factors 2 through 5 are self-efficacy items. So we have 2 for the quiz and 2 for the exam. And we can see in this matrix that all our self-efficacy factors correlate positively with positive emotions and negatively with negative emotions. Additionally, we have a measure for prior achievement. We took their prerequisite grade for the course because this was at the beginning of semester. We don't have their course grade yet. But as expected, all the self-efficacy factors correlated positively with achievement. So we have evidence of convergent and divergent validity of the MACE through this matrix. So this is the scale that we're moving forward with. And there are a few things that I want to point out. The first is that we chose to preserve as many items as possible. It was important for us to try to capture as many features of assessment taking as possible to try to best measure what it means to be efficacious on an assessment. The second thing is that we tried to preserve configural invariance. That is that we wanted to use the same scale for both types of assessment so that we can have generalizable and transferable findings, and also to make comparisons. The third thing is that this scale is going to be subject to measurement invariance. So specifically, we have 2 more waves of data that have come in from Maths 208, and we're checking that the scale holds up across time. Okay, what else are we doing? Well, I just mentioned that we are checking the scale validity of all the scales that we're using. We're looking at changes in assessment-related affect during the semester. So how does the affect change between the 3 different time points? We're looking at the relationship between different affective constructs. And also we're aiming to predict academic performance. And we're doing this 2 ways. We're taking a general approach through structural equation modeling and looking at how different affective constructs explain final exam performance. or just general course performance. But also, we want to do a cluster analysis, which is going to look at students more individually. So like I was mentioning before, maybe female students with a stresses enhancing mindset respond differently to anxiety than male students with a stresses debilitating mindset. So we'll run an analysis to figure out what groups of students we have, and then just determine the impact that has on academic performance. Okay, so I've talked to you a bunch about what we're doing. So what was the point? Well, the MACE is going to be able to allow researchers to more accurately investigate self-efficacy in different types of educational contexts. So for example, we're going to use it to look at how self-efficacy changes over time, and if interventions aimed at targeting exam-related self-efficacy are effective. The rest of the research, we're going to attempt to address the gap in the literature by better understanding how trait affective constructs around mathematics assessment change over the course of a semester, and address the gap in the literature by better understanding student affect around different forms of mathematics assessment, the relationship between these things, and the correlations with academic achievement. This will hopefully help inform how we design assessment structures to best gauge student understanding. If we're not addressing affect in relation to assessments, and students' attention is consumed by anxiety, or we're not promoting enough positive experiences for them, then we're not actually getting the best grasp of how much they understand and how much progress they've made. So finally, I'll just talk a little bit about the limitations, and there's one very obvious one, which we're experiencing today. During the study, we went into a lockdown and the students learned online for half the semester. In particular, the mid-semester test took place online. And situated in our theory, since we're discussing the possibility that emotions in one form of assessment may then influence emotions in another form of assessment, this might be problematic. So we attempted to control for the consequences of this by introducing some new items into the last two questionnaires. And we did this, we tried to ask them about their emotions around taking the test online, and also the impact the lockdown had on their learning and the impact the lockdown had on their well-being. So this data is going to be incorporated into the analysis, at least as a control measure, but we additionally hope to use it as an opportunity to explore, for example, how external stressors can impact student beliefs and performance, and whether something like stress mindset and self-efficacy predict how students perceived learning online. So thank you very much for your time, and happy to take questions now.
All right, big round of applause to you, Kate. Thank you so much. It was very good. Now we've got 2 questions from Gray. Gray, I don't see your questions. Oh, do you want to ask them? Is that okay?
Sorry, I tried pressing Shift Enter and it just sent. I thought I was going to type the questions after I wrote I have 2 questions, but I can type them now quickly.
Okay. Or you can just state them now. I guess that's fine.
Okay. The first question I had was, you're kind of saying that there's no tools to measure this kind of self-efficacy and the affect and stuff like this in test situations, if I understood correct. But I imagine that in sports psychology, there must be quite a lot of literature on this sort of thing. Is there a substantive difference between a student taking an exam and a sportsman performing in a match?
Yeah, so there is, I'm sorry, I took down my slides, but Bandura, when we're talking about where we're situating this idea of self-efficacy and where it developed, he talks about how our measurements for self-efficacy need to be context specific. So the more specific that we can get, the better. So like in an ideal world, you would, I think, come up with as a new scale every single time you did something that was specific exactly to the thing that you're doing. But this is kind of impractical, because that means that you have to you can't necessarily make comparisons, you can't generalize and transfer things. So as specific as we can get and be practical is the most valuable thing we can do. But I did look for, like, I did see stuff that came up in sports psychology, because obviously there's a lot of research on efficacy in that sort of field, but their skills weren't really transferable to an educational context. Is that cool?
Yep, that's pretty good.
You have a second question, Gray? There's one question from Johnny.
Yeah, I'll ask my second question. Having been a 208 tutor, especially this year, I saw how little some of the students were engaged in online tutorials and stuff like this. If the quizzes are low stakes, do students with like a negative mindset actually partake in them?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is going to be something that we can look at because we're collecting all their performance measurements from this semester. I haven't done any of this analysis yet, but we do have all the data for that. So I definitely think that's something we can look at if students who have like a stress is debilitating mindset don't even take the quizzes. But I suspect that's more, actually, no, I don't want to make any claims about things that I don't know yet, but I wonder if these quizzes aren't generally perceived to be very stressful. We've actually asked like the stress mindset thing around the quizzes and around the exam separately. And early looking at the data shows that students don't have as debilitating a mindset around the quizzes. So I don't think they see it as much of a chore. And it's kind of like easier marks. So yeah, it'll be something that we look at definitely. And I know that there's been a lot of consequences conducting this research this semester. So we'll have to take into account how much that has impacted the data. And hopefully we can draw some meaningful conclusions anyway. We tried to ask about the COVID impact because I still think like, especially if we have like more pandemics in the future, but also just like major stressors or world events or having to learn online, we can have these sorts of hopefully generalizing these consequences and saying something meaningful with the results. So.
Good. Johnny, you next, if you want to ask your question yourself.
Sure. I was just wondering if you've looked at any differences between the online and in-person students. I was thinking in particular, like, even though we ask the same questions on the online exam, it really is a different thing to the in-person exam.
Well, the 208 exam this semester was in person, right? Yeah, so yes, but their test was online. I'm not sure if I've 100% understood, but are you talking about like the international students that have had to learn online?
Yeah, I was thinking about the remote students who are taking the exam online anyway.
Yeah, so we have them as a group of people, and so we're going to look at that comparison as well, because obviously there's so many variables this semester. So we're going to try to treat the groups of people as individually as possible.
All right. Any more questions? Offer?
Okay, first of all, thank you very much for the presentation. Really enjoyed it. I wanted to ask you, how do you define negative or positive emotions? Because actually you raised a really interesting point during the presentation that stress, for example, could be perceived as both depending on context or intensity.
Yeah, so I kind of, how to explain this? Most of the literature uses the idea of negative emotions being negative, like things that we generally experience negatively, and positive emotions being things that we generally experience positively. So I think I mentioned actually in the class this semester that things that we experience positively, like the emotion being calm or being relaxed, isn't necessarily a good thing when it comes to taking a test or something, because there's not a lot of research done into this emotion in particular, like calm, but there's suggestions that it could correlate negatively with motivation. So being too relaxed isn't a good thing, but just in terms of like grouping them for the sake of discussion, it's easier to give them some form of labels. Otherwise we're just going to have problems. And in general, like most research has shown that what we call negative emotions correlates negatively with things that we think are good. So anxiety most of the time has been shown to correlate negatively with things that like engagement and attention and all that sort of stuff. But we're trying to moderate it with something like stress mindset to see if, because there's been a few studies that have indicated that it's dependent on like types of students and how they interpret that emotion. And so stress mindset is hopefully going to moderate anxiety in particular. And that's again why we're trying to do a cluster analysis to try to group these types of students. So from my understanding, the cluster analysis is going to like identify patterns and responses and recommend how we group the students, and then how that they respond to different things differently. Yeah, so I think that there's complexity in there, but just for sake of communication, like I know it's frustrating to say like negative emotions don't always have negative consequences, but also we need to call things something, right? So that I think that's just become like the terminology that people have used, and we'll hopefully, when we discuss the research, we'll point out all these nuances in the relationships.